So at this point, I think most of you know that one of the things that I absolutely love about One Piece is Oda's attention to detail and planning. Some things introduced at the beginning of the story or near the beginning of the story could be really anywhere, can have significance many chapters, many years down the road. There is just something beautiful and satisfying to witness a person with a mind capable of handling all of these ideas and putting the story together 20 years before anybody has a chance to see it. Not only layering a story that we have the opportunity to enjoy weekly, but layering a story within the story that unfolds over the course of many years. So the Chekhov's gun that we want to discuss today is the Cursed Swords. And the idea is to ask the question, what powers do they really have? And what will be their role in the story? Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So, it seems pretty apparent to me that the idea that was going through Oda's mind when he first introduced Cursed Swords in the Kitetsu blade near chapter 100 when Zoro found it in a shop is finally going to come to some kind of head. I want to make this very clear, guys, at least I want to make my opinion very clear. This is not something that just exists in the story to exist. Oh, Cursed Swords, cool. Move on. No, this actually is going to play some role in the story aside from it being a sword. And while Wano does not have to be the conclusion of this idea, after some 800 or so chapters, it's clearly going to be the next step in the evolution of that plotline. Because admittedly, since it was first introduced, we have not really gotten any more information about them. And in Wano, we have finally found, or Zoro has finally found, his second Kitetsu blade, as cursed as the first. And as we should have already expected, Oda has already hinted or straight up suggested that Zoro will acquire this sword, and has already showed an interest in it, even if he hasn't yet acquired it. So let's talk about it, some things that are related to it, possibilities, and my own process of elimination. Let's start with what we know, which is not all that much. The idea that we were given about the Cursed Swords and what the curse really represents is the fact that they kill their users. And I also believe that Oda gave us an idea as to how the swords would accomplish this only a few dozen chapters after Zoro first obtained his Kitetsu. Zoro described the sword as having a will of its own. And I want to make this very clear, guys, this does not only apply to the Cursed Swords, although the Cursed Swords have a unique manifestation of this. It's also suggested by Tashigi and Zoro as well to a slightly lesser extent that pretty much all swords that exist have their own spirit or personality. As you guys know, Tashigi is looking to acquire all of the famed swords and take them out of the hands of those who would do evil with them. And as she is looking at the Wado Ichimonji, she says, these swords are crying. The swords here are being personified, but this is not an isolated case because we have all sorts of other information which suggests the very same thing. As the shop owner tells us, the sword chooses its owner. The swords in a way allow themselves to be wielded and have their own will or agenda. And Zoro was capable of immediately perceiving this same will within the cursed blade. He could sense its curse. And later we could see that it could actually act upon this agenda by cutting something that Zoro had not willed. And then Zoro proceeds to personify this sword once again, calling it a problem child. Guys, just like a lot of things in One Piece, a specific example would be the ships of One Piece, these swords are very much alive. I think that we can make a very reasonable guess as to how exactly the Cursed Swords have killed their previous wielders. The sword chooses its owner. If the sword has an agenda, a goal, or a will, it depends upon the swordsman to achieve whatever that may be. And I believe that it is fair to say that the Cursed Swords are cursed because they have a will to cut and a will to kill. If they are not satisfied with whoever is currently wielding them, they will find another. Or maybe to take this one step further, maybe they will kill their wielders anyway, because they just can't help it. Now there is a force that sort of counteracts and balances, and it's a big reason why Zoro has been able to wield the Sandai Kitetsu for almost the entirety of the story. And that is the fact that although the swords have a will and an ability to act, a great swordsman would be able to contain that and enforce his own will above the will of the sword. I think that we see Oda demonstrate this when Zoro first acquired the Sandai Kitetsu. He threw the sword up into the air and pitted his own luck, he called it, but I'm going to call it will, versus the swords. Essentially saying to the sword, cut me if you can, if that is what you desire. And the sword either could not, or would not, or a combination of the two. So Zoro won that battle, and has continued to win it since then. Well, this is probably where we need to get into even heavier discussion and speculation. Because just because Zoro has mastered the Sandai Kitetsu does not mean that its curse is now irrelevant and the curse has absolutely no effect on him. And so guys, to be blunt with you for just a moment, I see a lot of people speculating one of two things: that Zoro should either acquire all 3 Kitetsu blades by the end of the story and wield them. Those would be his 3 final blades in the story, and or he will replace the Kitetsus. They are not all the same strength. He first acquired the weakest. The one that we see in Wano is in the middle, and there is the strongest, that he will replace them one after another, like a power-up. But I absolutely dislike both of these ideas because I do not think that these swords are right for Zoro, because they are inherently evil. In my mind, to Zoro and in the story of One Piece, a sword's relationship with its wielder is almost sacred, it's spiritual. And the two should share an objective. So let's talk about the Wado Ichimonji, which is suggested to be an inherently good sword. We can sort of speculate what its agenda, what its goal, its will would be, which is to do good and acquire feats. It wants to be wielded by the very strongest swordsman, and it does not want to kill indiscriminately. So Zoro achieving his dreams by the end of the story, joining the Striads, accomplishing every good thing that will come from that, all the while becoming the strongest swordsman, would fulfill Zoro obviously, but also the sword. However, Zoro's relationship with any cursed sword will always be strained, because the sword wants to kill. It's bloodthirsty. And Zoro is actively preventing it from doing what it wants. It's basically a toxic relationship. Either one or the other would need to change, or divorce is incoming. I know that that concept may sound out there to some of you, but again, the swords are personified. They are very much alive. And so just like the relationships between everybody else in the story, or even looking between the members of the Straw Hat crew, there must be cohesiveness. You've got to see eye to eye. And so in my opinion, at some point in the story, Zoro has to realize that the Kitetsu blades are not blades that he should be using, even if he himself sees it as a challenge, something to overcome in order to be the strongest swordsman. So this kind of leads us back into Wano and the fact that a second cursed sword has appeared, and it seems very, very likely that Zoro will obtain it and use it. So let's start off by addressing the elephant in the room. Zoro is not a 4-sword style user. So why, in what world, would he use this cursed blade? Well, the only way that this makes sense, because he has a personal attachment to all of his swords, is if one or more gets broken or lost. I've seen a couple theories on the subject. There are some things that we can derive from the manga itself, but if you're talking about Shusui, Shusui is property of Wano. It is their sacred treasure, their heirloom, and they want it back. Kinemon has stated as much. So this should definitely be a plot line in Wano, which Zoro just might lose Shusui, or it gets taken from him, or he decides to return it, therefore only having 2 swords and needing a third. The other things which I don't necessarily agree with, but are definite possibilities, is the destruction of either the Sandai Kitetsu or the Wado Ichimonji. I believe that they would have to be destroyed. But for the sake of this theory, let's ignore the possibility that the Sandai Kitetsu ends up broken, because if that happens, then I'm going to be straight up wrong. But in any of these other cases, Zoro would now be wielding 2 cursed swords. And as Zoro sort of described the Sandai Kitetsu beforehand, a second problem child. What would be the effect of 2 cursed swords? And so the first thing, guys, and this might be the most popular community theory relating to the cursed swords, is the possibility that each one gives Zoro some kind of power. One of the most popular theories that has ever been created for One Piece is that Zoro's Asura style is actually something that he was able to learn because he was wielding the Sandai Kitetsu. Now guys, Asura is one of the most mysterious things in the story because we don't know the origin of the power, we don't know how Zoro came to learn it, and I don't really want to spend this video trying to justify the idea or really debunk it in any other way. I personally don't believe in it, but that's beside the point. That is the idea. Asura being a Hindu god, maybe this other Kitetsu blade would have a different manifestation and give Zoro some other form, for lack of a better word. This sort of couples with the idea that after the time skip, Zoro closed one eye and he has sort of a scar over it, and that maybe he's holding the curse, the power of the curse within that closed eye. And when he inevitably ends up opening it, he'll have something like the Sharingan, which will be a physical change to his body because of the curse. And so guys, while I might not entirely agree with this idea, I do like certain concepts from it. But as we sort of already explained earlier in this video, there's reason for me to sort of disagree with the fact that the cursed swords are unique because of this theoretical possibility. I don't think that the cursed swords are the only ones with will and the only ones that are alive. Every sword has a spirit. And so a lot of people spin this as, well, Asura could be the spirits or in some way the manifestation of the sword itself. So Zoro absolutely needs to acquire the other more powerful cursed swords because he needs that as a personal power. But my argument would be that if the cursed swords are capable of this feat, so too would every other blade. So Shusui and the Wado Ichimonji, which are not inherently evil swords, would also have their manifestation and give Zoro their own unique power-up. What I am saying is, if you buy this theory, who's to say that the Asura form is the spirit of the Sandai Kitetsu? Maybe it is in fact the spirit of the Wado Ichimonji, the sword that Zoro is most deeply connected with, and that has traveled with him for the longest. So Zoro does not need the cursed swords. And if you really want to hype up the community, or if I really would want to do that, I might mention the possibility, the theory, that if Asura is the form, the manifestation of the Wado Ichimonji, then I wonder what the manifestation of Shusui might be, or any other swords that Zoro might acquire before the end of the story. And through this, you could potentially justify another reason why Zoro has to get rid of the Kitetsu blades. If we're talking about sort of the resonation between the sword and Zoro himself, and we've already made the argument that Zoro and the Sandai Kitetsu, and really any Kitetsu or cursed blade, would never resonate like that, then maybe in order to achieve the power-up that the community wants, he needs to find a sword that is more in line with his own objectives, to become one spiritually with the sword. But of course, this is all just a theory, and we don't really know if these swords have any particular power. Asura could literally just be a manifestation of Zoro's own spirit outside of his body. I want to argue another way in which the curse could have some significance, and it needs to relate in some way to Zoro acquiring a second Kitetsu. Because if Oda chooses to go in this direction, then he will be doing so for a reason. And so as we said before, having a second Kitetsu means essentially double the curse. I think that a lot of people are in love with the idea that, Zoro being able to handle two Kitetsu blades at the same time, that is a representation of how good he is as a swordsman. But I really don't think that it's necessary. A representation of how good Zoro will be as a swordsman is by defeating the world's strongest swordsman. You don't need any other justification than that. He's not somehow better than the best by also having to wield two cursed swords. They are only a hindrance for them because he has to bother to spend the energy to control them. They in a way nerf him, they weaken him. So we could actually see this plotline play out at some point in the future of the story, in my opinion I would guess Wano itself, where he's trying to use the other cursed blade with his Sandai Kitetsu. In the middle of a very important fight, they don't do what he wills them to, leading to his defeat. But the issue that I have with this, and again, this is really niche, and this is probably a case of thinking too much about it, most likely, but that's why we are here, I guess, is if Zoro ever encountered a situation in which he couldn't control one of his swords, he wouldn't look at that as being negative to the sword, he'd look at that as being negative to himself as a swordsman. He, Zoro, should have been better, and imposed his will upon the sword. So if we are looking for a reason for Zoro to realize that he no longer needs to wield them, or that it's negative to do so, then the swords need to have some other effect. And this sort of leads back to the idea of the relationship between the two. It's toxic. Zoro will not die, so in order for the two to live together happily, one or the other must change. The swords must be good, must be turned good, or Zoro influenced to do evil. The swords want to cut, and the swords want to kill. I could very much see Oda viewing the curse as something similar to the Ring of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. A ring which corrupted the person who wears it. Now guys, I don't consider myself to be an expert about Lord of the Rings, but from an outsider's perspective, I think that you could argue that the ring in a way represented Sauron, and those who wore the ring became tainted by his power. Or I guess if we're using my terminology, his will. It, just as we speculated for these swords in One Piece, choose their owner. In the case of the Ring of Sauron, its chosen owner is Sauron himself, and wishes to find a way back to him. Sometimes at the cost of the lives of those who wear it. At the very least, at the cost of their sanity. So what I am proposing here, guys, is that maybe once Zoro acquires the second Kitetsu blade, the second cursed sword, maybe he does evil. Maybe the swords change him, corrupt him, in a way that he does not initially perceive, or he determinedly attempts to fight against and fails. And perhaps this leads to a moment in which Zoro cuts an ally or a friend, the innocent. And we've talked recently about the possibility that Zoro leaves the crew. I know that that idea is divisive, but this kind of possibility really adds to that theory, because Zoro may not be himself, and it may take him a moment to realize that. But anyway, before we end this video, I want to include an old theory that I made that sort of ties into this indirectly, maybe a little bit directly, but I think sort of completes it, which is, you know, JB, if you're speculating that Zoro should get rid of his cursed swords, and speculating that eventually he will have two, where exactly will he get two new blades? So on one hand, guys, he could potentially earn Shusui back, even if it is taken from him in Wano. There's a very popular theory that Zoro is actually the descendant of Ryuma, and it is his sword by right. For the other sword, I have speculated that Zoro will actually have his own unique blade created for him in Wano. This was before we knew about Kitetsu. So then by the end of Wano, he would have the sword of his sensei, the Wado Ichimonji, the sword of his ancestor, Shusui, and then his very own sword with no legacy tied to anyone else but Zoro. Zoro's sword. But anyway, guys, that is all that I have to say today. As always, I'm curious as to what you guys are thinking. Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments section below. Like the video if you liked the video, dislike the video if you disliked the video. Make sure to subscribe if you want to be notified for my future content. And as always, guys, have a wonderful day.